Welcome to Lesson 2. Here I'm going to cover functions, a couple of new data types, arrays, and objects, and then move on to events and advanced debugging. When you finish this lesson, you'll be able to create small programs with more complex behavior that can react to user input. You'll still be using the console for output in this lesson. I understand you're probably eager to start writing code that interacts with a real web page, but bear with me. That's what the entirety of Lesson 3 is all about. For now, let's get started with functions. You've already used many functions throughout Lesson 1, alert, console log, math random, and the various string functions, to name a few. Now you'll learn how to create your own functions that perform other custom actions. The main reason for writing a function is to prevent you from writing the same code multiple times. If you find yourself performing the same actions more than once or twice, it's a good idea to create functions for those steps. Then, if you need to do it again, just use the function instead of typing out those steps again. In the same way that variables are declared using the var keyword, functions are declared using the function keyword. Here are all the parts to a bare minimum function. You have the function keyword, the name of the function, followed by a pair of parentheses and a pair of brackets. Inside the brackets, you put the code that defines what you want the function to do. Valid function names follow all the same rules that variable names do. So let's go ahead and create this function. I've started a new Sublime Text project for this lesson. The HTML file loads a JavaScript file called functions.js. Right now that's a blank file. Pause here if you need to and go ahead and set up a project yourself with the same two files. You can also download the files from the course's website. Once you're done with that, just type in the say hello function, and in the body of the function there's just one line, console log hello. Now to execute a function, you just type the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses, and a semicolon of course. This is known as calling a function. When you call a function, the code inside the brackets of the function gets executed. So if we save this and load index.html into a browser, sure enough, it is logged hello. Now when you call a function, you can pass data to it. You specify what that data is by placing it in the parentheses of the function definition, like so. Here, name is called a parameter of the function. Parameter names follow all the same rules as variable names. And in fact, what you're doing here is creating a variable called name that is only available to the body of this function. That variable's value is set when you call the function. Now you can use that parameter in your function's code. Here we're just concatenating name onto hello. Don't forget the space. Now when you call the function, you can pass in a name. Save and run that, and it says hello Tracy. Your function can have multiple parameters. Just separate them with commas. I'll add another one called useAlert. And in the body of the function, I'll use this in an if statement to either use the alert to output the message or use the console. Now if useAlert is true or evaluates to true, then alert will be used. And if useAlert is false or evaluates to false, console.log will be used. The evaluates part is important. Remember type coercion. Right now we're just calling the function with the name parameter. In this case, useAlert will be undefined. This will evaluate or be coerced into false, so the console will be used. This winds up being very useful because it makes that second parameter optional. If you just type say hello with a name, you get the default console behavior. But if you type say hello name, true, then you get the alert behavior. The last major thing you need to know about functions is that a function can send data back to the line of code that called it. You've seen this with many functions before, such as math random. Here, the math random function is generating a random number and sending that back to the line of code that called it. That value is assigned to the rand variable. We say that a function returns a value. You specify the data a function will return with the return keyword. Let's keep going with math random for our next function. As you know, math random returns a decimal number between 0 and 1. And I mentioned in lesson 1 that if you wanted a larger random number, like between 0 and 100, you can multiply this by 100. But this will still give you a decimal number, something like 65.49929. But sometimes you need a random whole number between 0 and 100, for example. Something like 37 or 48 or 93. Well, you can generate a random number, multiply it by the maximum value, like 100, and then use math round to round it to the nearest integer. Well, that's 3 steps you'd have to do every time you wanted a random integer. And again, multiple steps that you need to do multiple times are perfect candidates for functions. So let's define a random int function like so. This function has one parameter, max, which represents the maximum number that will be returned. Then generate a random number and multiply it by max, storing this in a variable called rand. Next, say rand equals math round rand. This rounds the value of the rand variable and stores the result back in rand. Finally, return rand. You can then call the random int function passing in a max number. In fact, you can wrap that right in a console log statement and have it output to the console. Now we already have some code here that's calling the sayHello function. I don't want that to happen right now, but I don't really want to delete it either. So this is a good time to introduce comments in JavaScript. You're probably already aware of comments from HTML or CSS. These have formats like the ones shown here. The browser will just ignore anything inside of those comments. JavaScript also uses these /* type comments that CSS uses. In addition, you can turn any single line into a comment by starting it with a double //. When JavaScript sees this //, it completely ignores that line. You can use this for temporarily disabling a line of code. In Sublime Text, Control or Command plus the / is a shortcut for creating a comment. Note that it also turns all the text on that line gray, for a visual indication that this is no longer functioning code. Of course, the original purpose of comments was for adding actual comments to your code that help explain what's going on, like so. So now you can save this and run it in a browser. You'll see that the sayHello function is not running because it's now commented out, but we do get a random integer. Refresh the page a few times and verify that you get other random numbers, all from 0 to 100. Now, one very important thing to realize is that the rand variable is only available inside the body of that random int function. The variable is created only when the function is called. It is assigned a value and can be used within the function, but once that function ends, that rand variable disappears. Variables declared within functions are called local variables because they don't exist outside the confines of that function. We also talk about the scope of a variable. The scope defines the parts of that code where a variable is visible and can be used. Here, the scope of the animal variable is the doSomething function. And in our code, the scope of the rand variable is the random int function. Let's try to access rand outside of the function and see what happens. We'll just say console log rand. And you can see that rand is not defined outside that function. In fact, just by trying to access it, we're getting an error. Okay, so that's the basics of what functions are and how to create and use them. You'll be seeing plenty of them as the course progresses though, so before long they'll become one of your best friends.